Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back. I want to give a special welcome to those who are joining us via webcast by live streaming. My name is Richard Snyder. I'm the director of the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies here at Brown University. And I want to welcome everybody to the wrap-up concluding panel of our two-day conference on the topic of declining inequality in Latin America. Are the good times over? And we have a concluding panel that we hope will help all of us make sense of what we have learned and discussed over the last day and a half. The title of the panel is What Do We Know About Inequality in Latin America? And how effectively do we communicate about it to the public? And the conference so far has focused on presentations by scholars and practitioners. And here we have a panelist of distinguished practitioners of communication, a panel of colleagues from both traditional media and new media who are known for their reporting on political and economic issues facing the region of Latin America. And I want to share with you the charge that the conference organizers, myself, Nora Lustig, and Ricardo Lagos, gave to the panelists, so you have a better idea of what to expect. And we asked the panelists to help us give a presentation about what they think the key takeaway messages are from this conference that would be of broad interest to non-academic and non-specialist audiences, both in Latin America and beyond. And we sort of asked the participants in the panel to be embedded participants in the conference. And we invited them to draw in their presentation on insights generated by their participant observation to help us do a better job, us meaning scholars and practitioners, of producing and communicating knowledge about inequality in Latin America that is both intelligible to and also usable by non-experts. Okay, so before I introduce our first speaker, I just thought it'd be helpful to give you one example of effective communication about inequality in Latin America. And here's a picture I wanted to put up here. This is by the Brazilian photographer, Tuca Vieira, and it's a picture of the slum in the city of Sao Paulo, Paraisópolis, juxtaposed with, this is not a slum over here. And it's a very provocative image. And we had a discussion earlier today about the importance of considering how inequality feels. So I invite you to consider what it feels like to be in, I think these are jacuzzis on these balconies, to be sitting in a jacuzzi looking out over Paraisópolis, a slum of 100,000, 80,000 people. And you might ask yourself, you might wonder, well, why am I here? Why are they there? And is there any connection between those things? Likewise, you could imagine living in one of these, they look like corrugated roofs. During a rainstorm, it could be very noisy inside these dwellings, to say the least. You might imagine living in one of these and looking up. I don't know if you could actually see the jacuzzis from that point of view, but you'd certainly see the building and wondering, well, why am I here? And why are they there? And what's the connection between us? Just to not be too serious about things, here's another quick visual about inequality. We have two elephants. One elephant asks the others, says when he talks about income inequality, he's promoting class warfare and should be impeached. And the other elephant says, we can impeach the Pope? With a question mark. Okay, so that's my introduction to the panel. We're going to begin with Eduardo Porter, who may need to leave early, and then we'll move in alphabetical order for the remainder of of the panelists. And I'm going to introduce everyone by turn. Eduardo Porter, actually, before I introduce him, I've asked everyone to speak for 10 to 12 minutes, and in the interest of equality, 2-minute warning. This thing, if you read closely, it says, "For the love of God, please stop talking."
I think you have to turn it around.
Oh, it's on the other side. And we're going to start with Eduardo Porter, who writes the economic scene column for the New York Times. Formerly, he was a member of the New York Times editorial board, where he wrote about business and economics. He is also the author of the very interesting book, The Price of Everything, Solving the Mystery of Why We Pay What We Do. Eduardo, welcome.
Thank you very much, Richard. Thank you, President Lagos, for inviting me to this conference. It's been a very interesting couple of days. It's a little bit daunting to be here before you guys, learned specialists, scholars in the subject of income inequality in Latin America. I'm just a hack, you know. I tend to deal in more hand-wavy types of arguments. I am rarely statistically significant. What's more, I have not been in Latin America for living there for a good quarter century. And I rarely write about this. Interestingly, that picture of the swimming pools and the slum next door appeared in a column, one of the very few columns I've written about Latin America in recent times, which was about the declining inequality that we've been talking about today. What I do write about, though, is I write about a lot about inequality in the United States. And in comparison, how the United States looks in comparison to other, you know, advanced and perhaps less advanced countries. And listening to the conversation here over the last couple of days, it felt to me that that was perhaps a relevant experience for me to talk about here. That one thing that I felt that was perhaps a little bit missing was the narrative of Latin America in a broader context of what other countries are trying to do, how they are facing these challenges, and how they are thinking about inequality. And that is something that I thought perhaps I could bring to the table. Because I do think that, I mean, as I write about this here, I face challenges in getting across to the public with every column. Columns often fall into standard ideological slots. You know, my friends on the left love me, my enemies on the right hate me, and it becomes ultimately unsatisfying because you're preaching to the crowd and you don't want to do this if you really want to kind of like move the public debate. And so I found that a way to do this, or at least, you know, to gradually bring over somebody, you know, to convince somebody at the American Enterprise Institute not to hate me that week, you know, one way to do this is to bring in data and to bring in comparative, especially comparative data. So when I put, you know, the infant mortality rate in the United States against that of Portugal, that's kind of like an incontrovertible fact. Or you know, life expectancies or incarceration rates. And so that has become, for me, my favorite tool of kind of communicating where we are as a country. And I think that it not only helps me convince people that are difficult to be convinced, but it also, I think, helps us understand these issues in a more real way, right? Inequality can become an abstraction very easily. And so you need to talk about it in terms of these more concrete kind of outcomes. And this brings me to these past couple of days. One thing that I did feel missing was the contextualizing it in the broader global story of inequality. And I think I have something to say about that. And because even though Latin America is following apparently a very different path from inequality in other regions, the Ginies are falling rather than rising, I would say that in terms of the real important question, which is what is the challenge going forward, Latin America is not that very different from other places with very, very high and rising income inequality. So I mean, just if the question is, what do we know about inequality? What do we learn from this conference? Are the good times over? My guess from what I've heard is yes, they are, and they weren't really that good in the beginning, you know, from the first place. So to me, is, well, what does the rest of the world tell? What can we learn in Latin America from the rest of the world? For me, one, we've been talking a lot, I've been hearing a lot about taxes and transfers and how to make them cheap and how to make them effective and whatnot. But it felt to me that we were like negotiating in really in a small little corner over here with a big problem that's kind of like occupying the entire room. I mean, to my mind, you know, if you have a tax to GDP ratio of 20%, which is what you have in Chile, what you have in Colombia, what you have in Mexico, you can pretty much forget of taxes and transfers as a way to solve income inequality. I mean, if history is going to tell us anything, the places who have managed to the social democracies that have established pretty decent tax and transfer systems that effectively reduce market inequalities, they're, you know, we're talking about Scandinavians, mid-40s%. We're talking about, you know, high 30s%. Brazil is the only country in Latin America that gets anywhere near that, in about 35, but everybody else is 20s, and some are even in the teens. So the social democratic path towards greater equality seems to me to be closed from where I sit, where I'm looking today. So we have to look, well, what else is there for, you know, if we're looking for a model, where do we go? Does the United States work? I mean, the United States is really not a model of equity at all, but it had a fairly decent second half of the 20th century, or say from World War II to 1980. You know, you had a very fast growth of the middle class. A chart that was put in earlier today, you saw the nice bit of the Kuznets curve, which doesn't exist. And so is that a possibility? I would argue, again, that that's probably no, because the United States built this middle class in an economic context which Latin America is not today, of very fast growth, where American companies essentially dominated their markets as Western European companies were just trying to rebuild from the war. I mean, it was a very unique period of American dominance that allowed to build a middle class on a fairly high wage. That's no longer available even for the United States, and I don't think it's a path available for Latin America. And so then, what have we got? What have we got left? And there, I would say that there's a lot to learn from the debate that's going on in the United States, which is pretty much like this. Well, what do we got? What do we got left? Because in the US, the idea of taxes and transfers is pretty much off the table, too. And so you get more and more people, from Bob Solow to Joe Stiglitz, talking about, well, what if we don't have taxes and transfer available? The education story sounds nice, but it hasn't really worked. In fact, in the United States, as in Latin America, education intensifies inequality. So what else have we got? And I think there are tools. I mean, there's ways of thinking out of the box, and I think that in Latin America would be interesting if these sorts of thoughts were kicked around as well. So, like, what am I thinking about? First, you have legal systems. I mean, when Piketty says that R is bigger than G, that the return to capital of the rich is bigger than the economic growth of the world, he's omitting the fact that there are legal regimes and rules and regulations that are actually allowing this to be so. So, for instance, you know, there's intellectual property regimes that protect the return on patents and copyrights. There are grandfathering rules that when we have a new environmental or health regulation, we protect the existing capital stock so that the rate of return on that capital stock is protected. We have rules, antitrust rules, that it seems to me pay very little heed to the kind of impact on production, and that could do a much better job at resisting monopoly power, which, me being from Mexico, it's something that I carry very close to my heart. I think in many Latin American countries, we have very, very monopolized economies, and this tends to increase the rents and increase the rate of return on capital. So there are these tools to kind of like reduce rent seeking, to improve market equality, and that do not really require big tax and transfer systems that I don't think are available right now in Latin America and in the foreseeable future, especially considering where economic growth is going to be. Just to finish this little thought, Atkinson, the economist that deals with the great income inequality economist, is just about to come out with a book. It's imminently going to come out, which is called Inequality and What to Do About It. And he takes on this exact thing. He's looking at the UK, which is a country that has a much flatter distribution of income. But so he says, how do I do to bring the distribution back to where it was in the 1960s or 70s? And he first starts looking at standard taxes and transfers. Well, how can I get there? And you know, for all he tries, he can only bring it 40% of the way. So the rest, he says, I'm going to need to do something else. And so what does he do? He proposes, different competition policy, a competition policy that takes into account distributional issues, not just efficiency issues. He talks about strengthening unions and bringing back kind of like the sort of dialogues between labor and corporate power that in fact in Latin America have existed throughout its history as well. He proposes guaranteed employment at a minimum wage, which is bringing back government employment. He also proposes that there be national discussions over the gap between the bottom and the top pay to bring corporate governance into the argument and try to reduce the super manager pay that Piketty speaks about so often. So, in all of these things, even as I list them, I'm thinking, dude, this sounds crazy. It's never going to happen, At the same time, I think, well, we can't just stand here and say, well, we're not going to get anything through. And so I do think that there are all these margins that definitely should be explored. And this even includes, I think, the winged unicorn in the room, which is democratizing the capital, ownership of capital. And that's actually getting a little bit of traction in the United States. The John Podesta's outfit, the Center for American Progress, has put it on as one of its core proposals. And Atkinson also mentions it, using a estate tax to fund. He throws some numbers around, but one number that stuck with me was $80,000 in a capital lump for every adult once he or she hits the age of 35. And you put limits on how it can be used. It can be used to pay for tuition, down payment on a mortgage, or something like that. But essentially, what you're trying to do is democratize the capital stock. And the problem we have with income inequality, which I think is also an issue in Latin America, is the fact that the return to capital is indeed higher than the return than economic growth and the return that one can get from the labor market. So, anyway, I sort of felt that that was missing here. What other ideas are there? The talk of education is great. The talk of directed transfers is great. Conditional transfers is great. But frankly, I don't see a lot of evidence out there that they can cut it right now. And I think that we need more tools. And then, okay, just to actually pay a little attention to what I was meant to talk about, which is how to communicate this. I'm just telling you, it's really tough. I work for a really nice place that lets me write whatever I want, and even there it can be difficult to get, the next column about income inequality in is like, well, okay, dude, And then you run into the standard responses from out there, and that can be a little bit discouraging. And I'm in a really great shape. A gentleman earlier was telling me, well, if I were trying to write these same pieces in Venezuela or Ecuador, I might be put in jail. So it's difficult that these kind of prescriptions, which are clearly not going to be welcomed by the rich here or in Latin America or anywhere, it's very difficult to get them across. I'm not reported. I used to report in Mexico, and I reported in Brazil. And my thought was that there's a problem with the cooptations of the kind of institutions like the media and others that might be able to put this argument forth. So when I reported in Mexico, this is a long time ago, the government essentially had a very tight control over what could be said, and it did it by, it was a main purchaser of advertisements in the local press, and it had all sorts of soft vehicles of control over what you'd say. I was in Brazil, the control is different. It's not so much cooptation by the government, but I remember that the top editor of the biggest newspaper in Brazil was driving around in a Maserati, or maybe it was a Lamborghini. But still, it was like the class interests of a person like this are really not necessarily in line with screaming a lot about income inequality. I don't have really good solutions, but I would have two things that I would say. One is that you need narratives. Something that I also missed over the last 2 days was narratives. There was a lot of points up there, but you need stories. How did we get from this to that? And even if it's not perfectly statistically significant somewhere, you do the leap anyway, and you let somebody tell you you're wrong. you know? I mean, that's what Piketty did. That's the power of Piketty's book. I'm sure there's all sorts of flaws in the theoretical underpinning and in the data, but hey, he did it anyway, and he caused a sensation. So I think you really need a narrative. I'm about to die here. And the last thing is, do these things there. I mean, the kind of power that, you know, this meeting here is very valuable, but I'm sure you guys all know each other, you know, and it's the power that this would have if you were doing it in Bogota or Santiago or in Mexico City would be much, much higher. You'd get the press in, everybody would write about it. But, you know, so yeah, I would suggest you do it again.
Thank you very much, Eduardo. Our next speaker is, and we're going to go in alphabetical order going forward, is John Lee Anderson. He is a staff writer for The New Yorker, and he has covered numerous conflicts for The New Yorker, including those in Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Iraq, Afghanistan, Angola, Somalia, Sudan, Mali, and Liberia. The amazing thing is that he's lived to tell about it. And he's also reported frequently from Latin America and the Caribbean, writing about Rio de Janeiro's gangs, the Panama Canal, the 2010 earthquake in Haiti, and a Caracas slum, among other subjects. He's also written vivid and telling profiles of Latin American figures, including Augusto Pinochet, Fidel Castro, Hugo Chavez, and Gabriel Garcia Marquez. He's also the author of several books, including Che Guevara, A Revolutionary Life, the best-selling and definitive 800-plus page biography of the iconic Marxist revolutionary Che Guevara. John Lee, it's a pleasure to welcome you back to Brown.
I fear I'm never going to live those 800 pages down. But and welcome to the untidy mind of a political writer, a storyteller, rather than an economist, or an economic writer, as is Eduardo. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Nora, President Lagos, Catherine, for inviting me back. It's been instructive. Can you all hear me okay? And I'm just going to, I can tell I'm going to have cotton mouth, so I'm going to get some water. I made a few notes today. Most of yesterday I spent in a state of bewilderment. But so just a few ideas here. Yeah, it's been a real privilege to hear such a collection of academic experts, most of you economists, share your knowledge and findings about these topics. And as a journalist used to reporting in the field, very much part of the non-statistical world, it was a very profoundly different experience for me. So, and I was acutely aware of my lack of schooling in these subjects. But as I listened in, two thoughts came to mind very quickly. First, the similarity between our conclusions about the causes of inequality. Although I think, if I had to say, there's a kind of consensus that I've picked up on here. It's that there isn't really a consensus on what inequality is. In fact, Ricardo Lagos at the beginning, I think, set the tone when he said, we've been successful at eradicating poverty, but not inequality, and that somehow is the muse that has stayed in the atmosphere and which remains the knot to unwind or to solve. Lack of access to education, unfair income distribution are key factors, as are lack of rule of law, systemic social violence, and lack of official transparency. In other words, corruption. And you've come through to your conclusions through academic research. I've come through mine through reporting empirically over the years, and in life experience. I should just say that as part of that life experience, I cut my teeth in Latin America as a young reporter, first in Peru and then in Central America at the beginning of the 80s, when it was all about insurgency and counterinsurgency. And as a boy of 17, I spent a year working as a machetero for $1 a day in Honduras. So that's where I learned my first Spanish and perhaps my first immersion in Latin America's social realities. So my first Spanish was very much peasant Spanish, peasants no longer being a feature of the Latin American landscape, apparently. But anyway, it's the second thought that struck me was how rarely our two worlds intersect, the world of academia, the world of media, with a few exceptions. There are reporters who specialize in economics and, and political economy, and those of us who are out there in the field, you know, at the moment at which I find synergy with your world is usually when I'm finishing an article and I'm looking for statistics, and I Google or Wikipedia some aspect. I want to find out, you know, how many people exactly were killed in Caracas last year, or what the rates of poverty are in Brazil, that kind of thing. And I think that, you know, we have a conundrum and a problem there, which is, you know, why don't the twain meet up? In part, it's because I think of something Eduardo pointed out, that, you know, I too deduce that most of you know one another. You speak a common language, and it does come down to language. And this isn't really a criticism, it's more of an observation about the kind of lexicon you must use as to communicate the tools of your trade. Gini quotients, various acronyms I've never heard of before, and other words that have now, they went in this ear and went out that one because nobody ever explained them to me. So much of what was said was, in some conversations, in some panels more than others, was complex or alien to me, but in which I would find difficult to communicate to the public. In my job as a narrative journalist, as someone working in the storytelling media, trying to communicate social or political problems. And I had a couple of thoughts in terms of what our assigned task was here and how to better communicate that. And, a good friend of mine works in human rights. I have a few friends who work in the human rights world, which is somehow parallel to ours and to yours. And of course, in the last 30 or 40 years, I would say since the Carter administration, it's taken on more and more relevance and currency in the world. It's become a big part of our perceptions. We take it into account politically and so on. But they found a few years ago that, you know, essentially, you know, they were always behind the 8 ball, if that metaphor works. You know, they were doing these dry reports that the larger public rarely read. They would try to get these reports into journalists' hands that would then distill them, and a few articles might see their way, and you still see that. You might see their way into the press here, the UK, wherever. But by and large, with the changing media environment we have, and also the public behavior, public reading, and public perceptions, and media consumer behavior, that they needed to really adopt a radical approach to how they operated, how they disseminated their information. And they began to essentially make human rights a brand within journalism, a genre within journalism. And I've done so with some success. And just in the last, I would say, 5 years, Richard mentioned some of the conflicts I've covered, but especially since, I would say, Libya, which was 4 years ago now, I became aware of the very proactive role of human rights activist campaigners in the conflict themselves, directing journalists to the stories, directing them to the trends that were emerging within the conflict, to things that made sense, that could be written about or reported on, and in some cases with access that the journalists didn't have. And that's a symptom of, in one sense, the imploding traditional economic journalistic model, where many mainstream newspapers and others no longer have bureaus in various parts of the world, and they rely upon, you know, freelancers with iPhones. And that there's nothing wrong with the iPhone, there's nothing wrong with freelancers, but you no longer have a store of knowledge necessarily there in increasing parts of the world. And in the case of Libya, and to a certain extent in Syria, and a few other conflicts, Central African Republic, I liaised very closely with friends and colleagues who were human rights campaigners, in some cases who were, better sourced, better contact, and had a better grasp on the issues than pretty much anyone else out there. It's an analogous field. I merely pointed out as an idea that, it's useful sometimes to think out of the box and to find new approaches in terms of communicating sometimes hard to grasp or dry information. Economists do have their media outlets. There's the Wall Street Journal, there's the FT, there's the Economist. Someone I mentioned this to yesterday, an economist said, I wouldn't regard the Economist as an economic. So that was revealing to me. I always did, but I guess, yeah. And of course, a whole slew of specialty journals, which largely inform the informed, right? There's authors like Jeffrey Sachs and others who can make and have been making essayistic or narrative arguments in book or the books or the media, and quite successfully and well, touching on some of these topics that we're talking about. And they've had a huge impact. More could be done, and there's still a gulf, and it seems to me that gulf can be bridged with a more proactive approach by academics to communicating their findings. Again and again, I felt that in some of the panels, there was some very kind of tantalizing half conclusions. Well, a few yesterday, I remember, came up and said, well, now that's politics and we can't figure that one out. And they stopped there. And that was precisely where I felt I could pick up. It was just a matter of a little suspension bridge, and having a conversation that could somehow entrain us and allow me to distill and pull in information and wisdom that you have. In the end, Eduardo touched on this. I think all of us probably feel similarly, and in the end, it's about telling stories. It's what humans like, whatever culture, whatever piece of the world they live in, and throughout time, it's been that way. And ideally, stories with a human face. The broader public's receptive to such storytelling, and it seems the ideal vehicle to better communicate the issues we're discussing. It's possible in form, but difficult to interest or engage people with flow charts of numbers and trends. The stories with the greatest public impact and therefore potential policy influence as well are those which break the issues down to universal human themes that can engage people across the social spectrum. A couple of examples, recent ones that I was thinking of that somehow I think illustrate what I'm talking about are the cases of the, well, we're talking about inequality in Latin America, the issue of economic migrants coming from Central America and across Mexico, the violence that's visited upon them, the issues that pertain to their arrival on the border and so on. But this has been a long-standing reality. But there's a few stories that have made this reality all that more pressing to the American and wider public, and have had huge legs in the media environment. One, not necessarily in this order, one is the case of the children arriving, the children being sent by their parents, this kind of very gripping, terrifying story, which people across the world can relate to, and all of its concomitant issues. The other would be, a similar one would be La Bestia, the beast, this train that comes up and bringing, migrants through gang territory where they're preyed upon by violent narco gangs and so forth. Wow, that went fast. I was just getting going. And this has found its way into not just print, but also long-form magazine stories, audio, NPR style storytelling, which reaches, really a very wide public, and also film. These are all ways in which essentially economic stories or stories of inequality can have a profound and lasting impact and actually cause social and policy change. you know, it took 800 Africans dying the other day in the Mediterranean to get not just the European, but the American public to actually focus on that issue. It's been happening for a long time. There was 700 that died a few months ago, but 850 this time did the trick. And now the EU and the US and everybody is talking about what they can do and what they must do. Haiti's earthquake similarly provoked a period of interest in that country's social realities. Haiti, by the way, if there was ever a country I wish that the region's economists would focus on as a matter of priority, it would be Haiti. And it's the one that was not mentioned here, I don't think once. Just as did Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. Finally, although this is only about half of what I had planned to say, you know, events can be seized upon by the media to highlight issues of inequality or injustice. Iguala's 44 murdered students make it possible to look at Mexico's chronic lack of rule of law and corruption. And other times, investigations themselves, you know, determined by a media outlet, for instance, the New York Times investigation into the Walmart scandal in Mexico was a case in point. It won the Pulitzer for that, and highlighting a kind of systemic phenomena across Mexico and across Latin America, where we have these free trade agreements that have reaped a whole whirlwind of other issues. Finally, I was recently invited to be a judge for a prize in Chile given by several social charities that have formed a kind of amalgam. It was just in January. And they came up with an idea to highlight social issues and to motivate journalists to write about these issues. They came up with a prize for reporting on inequality, essentially. And they asked me to be a judge and to choose the winner, which I did, and then they invited me to Chile to give a speech about it, which I just thought it was great. You know, I thought it was great. I was happy to do it because it seemed so novel and innovative to me. And anyway, a very praiseworthy way of highlighting issues that are not necessarily newsworthy, sexy, or cool, which unfortunately are somehow the holy trinity very often in determining what gets covered in this world by the media. So on that note, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John Lee. Up next, we have Maria Esperanza Casullo. She is a professor of politics at the Universidad Nacional de Rio Negro in Argentina, where she's also a visiting professor in the political science program at the Universidad Torquato di Tella. She was also previously the Koga visiting professor of Latin American studies here at Brown University. Her research focuses on democratic theory and the comparative study of populist political discourse in Latin America. She's also an active contributor to a lively blog on politics in Argentina and beyond, which is known as Arte Politica. Maria Esperanza, welcome back.
Okay, first of all, I want to thank all the organizers of the conference, President Lagos, Rich, Nora, for the invitation for me to come back to Providence, which I feel very much like home. I feel like I'm here straddling two worlds. I am not a journalist. I am a university professor. I'm a political scientist. But I have a PhD in political science, but my degree is in communication and journalism. And I like to think that I take my academic work seriously, but I also blog and use Twitter a lot, too much, I should say, my husband would say. And I like to engage in public discourse and debates in a way that oftentimes academics do not. And moreover, I study political discourse and political narratives, and I think that it's completely coincidental, but that the three speakers on the table picked up on the same theme, which is the same. Actually, my presentation was called Narratives on Inequality, and I changed it, which I'm kind of second guessing right now. So the thing is, these 2 days, we have been arguing about whether inequality is this and that, it grew, it fell, and the need for inequality reducing policies. But these 2 days, I haven't heard a coherent explanation of why inequality is bad. I think that we, as a community of thought, are engaging maybe in a little bit of a petitio principii, which is that we just jump into discussing what we can do because we know each other and we all sort of agree that this is what needs to be done. But in looking at the outward, at the bigger society, I think that this is a case that we must do more forcefully. And conversely, why is an egalitarian society better? I don't think that in the current political landscape of political discourse in Latin America, I don't think that this is not an idea that we can take for granted, that it's just out there. I think that it's kind of funny because I picked up an image, this is from Argentina, from the Diario La Nación, but it's very, very similar to the image that Rich presented. This is what and it's but not coincidence. Sao Paulo looks like this, Buenos Aires looks like this, Santa Cruz de la Sierra looks like this. And I think that, and yet we've seen in these presentations and in these sessions discussed over and over again, that we live with this every day. And democracy survived, and poverty was reduced, and life seems to go on, and I don't see any kind of sustained movements for this to change. So I think that there's a previous step that we need to say beyond measuring how many houses are there and how many houses are here, which is why should this change? Moreover, how should this be changed? In what directions? And I think this was even more absent from our discussions. Do we want those houses to have a swimming pool? Do we want these houses to not have a swimming pool and get smaller, right? Do we want the two of them to mix together? Do we know what kind of a new landscape we are trying to build? And I don't think that we do, frankly. So what we need, one of the key issues when you study the translation of big, broad ideas into political movements that are able to affect change, which is what I study, is the crucial role that narratives play. And I completely agree with John that narratives are the thing that the human mind latches on as the first explanatory way of grasping and making sense with the world. And narratives are not abstract numbers. They have a hero who wants to do something. There's a problem that needs to be overcome. There's obstacle, and there's an end. And so narratives are both explanatory and practical. They explain how and why things are, but they also give us hints, practical tips of how to proceed in the world, what we need to do to become heroes, how can we recognize a bad person, a villain in the narrative. I have small children. I have seen every Disney movie ever made, and that's exactly why they are so universal and powerful, because they are very basic narrative templates. And I feel I'm happy to be corrected, but I feel that we don't have that narrative yet. It can be a normative narrative, and I agree that it's perfectly okay to say we need to bring down inequality because inequality is bad, period. But it would be much more useful to have a narrative that is both normative and prudential. Why is inequality bad? Because it brings up crime? Are we sure about that? Because because everybody's happier? Are we sure about that? We need to have a bigger grasp of the prudential effects of inequality of our lives, that we can tell people we need to change this because then we are going to live better in this and this and this respect. We have that narrative about poverty. We have something like that. For example, I was thinking about illiteracy or gender. 100 years ago, people were going to say, it's okay for gender inequality. Gender inequality is better. Nobody's going to come out in the political landscape in Latin America and say that today. They might think that, but they are not going to say it, right? But a lot of people actually argue that inequality, a degree of inequality, is not only inevitable, but it's beneficial. So I think the hegemonic post-Washington consensus in Latin America is something much closer to saying, yes, we need a degree of inequality because it brings out dynamism, because it brings out innovation, because that's the way to compete in capitalist societies. I think, I don't have hard data, but this is much closer to the consensus than to think that we live in societies in which the consensus is we need to bring down inequality. Plus, picking up on something that Juan Pablo Luna was saying, we are facing one obstacle, that it's that inequality for a lot of people feels good, right? Juan Pablo was asking, how does inequality feel? For for some people, inequality feels good. They are able to get in the wonderful phrase of Eduardo Risis, an Argentine urbanist, exclusion rents. They get status premiums because they are inside things like public schools or services to where other people cannot enter. And we also find that in Latin America, there's a value of social distance, right? It's important to feel that, and people were mentioning this, if the poor rises up, I want to keep my distance. I don't mind that the poor are better as long as I am also able to climb and the relative distance is not changed. So what's the political thing to do? And this is tricky because there's a number of catch-22 effects taking place that also we saw this in several presentations yesterday, especially the presentations of Tasha Fairfax on taxation. There's a catch-22. In order for these reforms to take place, you need elite to agree to them. But of course, they won't, right? So that's a problem. Another problem that we discussed this morning is that in order for these reforms to take place, you need the state to be the kind of state that is able to do these reforms, which Latin American states are not, right? Another problem, which is also something that was not mentioned, but is the death of socialism, of a viable alternative, and what we can say has been the failure of the model of equality in Latin America, which was Cuba. Failure as a way of model to the rest of the continent. So what do we do? There is not a coherent theoretical economic alternative as socialism provided 40 years ago. Another topic that I want to just briefly mention is, what do we do with populism? Because in a way, when you study political discourse, you can see that with the exception probably of Chile, at least in South America, inequality is only present in a relevant way in the discourse of the populist regimes, which oftentimes have been the ones that were able to bring inequality the most these days. But a lot of people agree that this sort of more antagonistic, top-down, redistributionary efforts by governments such as Venezuela, Bolivia, Argentina, are imperfect, that bring about inflation, are not fiscally sustainable, which is fine. But then which is the way? Which is the alternative way to bringing about the kind of social change that we want? How do political parties and coalitions fit in? And as we were in the panel in the morning with Vicky Murillo, with Juan Pablo, with David Samuels, it was sort of a very paradoxical set of concepts because the consensus seems to be that inequality doesn't matter a lot politically. That voters don't vote on this topic, that parties don't create political platforms around this topic. So how can we figure out connections between the political system and democracy that has proven to be quite resilient in Latin America and the kind of fights for inequality that we would like to take place? So I just throwed out a bunch of questions. I don't really have the answers. One thing that I know for my research on human rights and protest movements in Argentina is that, and Vicky Murillo mentioned this, is that it is crucial that we're able to frame these debates in a language of rights. This works in Latin America. This is truly crucial and efficient in political terms in Latin America. We need data. We social scientists are very good at producing data, but we need political imagination. We need narratives, we need visions, we need ideologies, shall I venture to say, that give us not a depiction of the problem, but a depiction of what kind of we want to be walking towards. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Esperanza. Our next speaker is Juan Carlos Lopez. He is chief correspondent at the Washington, D.C. offices of CNN en Español. He is the host of the daily news program Directo USA on CNN en Español. He also moderates the political debate program Choque de Opiniones. I should add, we had invited him along with everyone to be here yesterday and today, but something came up that prevented him from being present during the discussions yesterday. So we're delighted he was able to make it up and be with us for this panel. Thank you. Welcome, Juan Carlos.
Thank you very much. Muchas gracias. Un placer estar aquí. First, I have to set this up. How do we? I want to break it down. So, thank you very much. I wanted to start telling you about the process I personally go through when we're putting together the show. When I do the reading, I find articles or studies or reports that are very interesting. But the question is, how do you turn that into TV, and how do you turn that into something that everyone wants to see or hear? And it's not by bringing cats from YouTube, and it's not by maybe putting models or soccer players. People are interested in hard news. People are interested in knowing about things that affect them. When you posted the picture of Tucavera and the picture of Buenos Aires, I thought of Washington, D.C. Our offices are located next to Union Station, close to the Capitol. And I've been at that office for 10 years. And in the last 10 years, it's gone through a very deep process of gentrification. And you have North Capitol, the Avenue, and on one side, you have these brand new buildings. They're all beautiful and very luxurious. And you just cross the street and you have the projects. And you have the people in Washington, D.C., not a mile from the U.S. Congress, seeing what people in Tucavera, Buenos Aires, or Bogota, or other cities see. So I know that inequality is something that people understand because it affects their lives directly. So what's the first thing that I do? I think this is interesting. How am I going to put it in a format that I can make it quicker, shorter, not dumb it down, but try to make it a little more agile? So I looked into the materials that were being prepared for the conference because I wanted to look for examples of things that were going to be presented. And I highlight. I am not saying these are right, wrong, good, bad. It's just what I saw in my reaction, and I have some examples of what we do on the show. So I found this. Ana, if you're here, I just want to use it as an example. The Chilean system of contributory pensions as locus of rivalry and of a new social compact. That is very specific. That is for everyone in this room. But it is dense. So that's a challenge. When you find this, the first thing you stumble upon it. So you say, what do I do? You have to read it, and then you have to find the highlights. So I looked at another one. So you have fiscal policy and ethno-racial inequality in Bolivia, Brazil, Guatemala, and Uruguay. Nora, Lustig. In the middle, commitment to equity. This gives me something short, gives me something strong, gives me something I can think about turning into something else. So when I have one of these stories, I try to connect it to people's daily lives, because I connect it to my life. And I brought a couple of examples from our show, and the first one has to do with the budget request. February, White House requested $4 trillion budget. So what are $4 trillion? They're not going to get it, they're going to spend it. But what does that mean, and why is that important or relevant, or how does that have any relevance to anyone who does not live in the United States? So I went over the figures, and I started looking and comparing it to other countries. So if the U.S. needs $4 trillion, how much does Brazil need? How much does Argentina need? How much does Chile need? And this is the result.
Y vamos a analizar, hacer una comparación. El presidente Obama le pidió $4,000 millones al Congreso para su presupuesto. Esto es solo una solicitud, pero decidimos comparar esta solicitud de $4,000 millones, un incremento del presupuesto del año pasado, con los presupuestos de otros países de la región. Y miren ustedes, Brasil, el que mayor presupuesto tiene en la región, que supera el billón de dólares, luego le sigue México con 345,000 millones, Argentina 149,000, Venezuela 118,000 millones de dólares, también están Colombia y Chile, Colombia con 108,000 y Chile con 62,000 millones, es decir, que si ustedes suman los presupuestos de todos los países del hemisferio, no alcanzan, probablemente no llegan ni a la mitad de lo que pide Estados Unidos para su presupuesto fiscal. Nos vamos a la pausa. Cuando regresemos vamos con la reacción republicana al pedido del presidente Obama de este presupuesto de $4 billones de dólares.
So that's a first example. So you take that big number and you try to put it into something that people understand. Now, what struck me the most personally after looking at those numbers was Brazil's budget, and how large Brazil is compared to the rest of the region, and how far away it is from the rest of the region. So I think that's an example. If you have the information, if you have something, is there a right way? There are many ways of telling what you have to say, but there are ways of trying to put it in in another context. Now, for my next example, I'm talking about basketball. And why basketball? Well, I read a report about March Madness and about how much Americans spend on gambling on March Madness in 4 days. And this happened to be around the same time that Senator Ted Cruz announced his candidacy for the Republican nomination. So it was the start of the race. We're talking about the most expensive political race in history. We had about $7 billion spent in 2012. And when I saw the figures, I was shocked. And I decided it's time consuming because you have to go and compare and you have to verify that the numbers that you're giving are real. But I went and I verified, and this is what we found. And don't tell me that I have the wrong clip again.
Y vamos a analizar, hacer una comparación. El presidente Obama le pidió...
No, that's not it. Okay, so I got the wrong clip. If you look at March Madness, Americans spend $9 billion in bets in 4 days. The last election cycle was $7 billion for all the races, 4 legislative, 4 presidential, 4 governorships. And that just gives you an idea of how large this economy is and what priorities are. And we have this debate about campaign spending, about the money that people spend in politics, about the money that politicians get, about the money that corporations give. But then we have this event, and you have universities that have the teams, the NCAA, 68 teams. You have athletes who don't get paid. You have TV rights over $1.2 billion. And yet again, we spend more on gambling on this tournament than we do. And I think if you're at home and you see this, this makes you think, and it makes you think about inequality. And I thought, is there a way of tackling a very hard subject and getting people to think about it and getting people interested in reading what you wrote and seeing that the work that you do is about their lives and it's about their future and it's about their kids and it's about the importance of having a strong region. And I decided to bring up beer. I'm not endorsing a specific brand. I'm not endorsing the consumption of alcohol, although this one's pretty good. But I thought this message was very strong in many, many respects. And I want you to watch it, and then I'll tell you why it really, really made me think.
We take great care with what goes into our chalice. Honey, maize, hops, barley, and water. And because water is so important to us, we've partnered with water.org to help those who don't have access to it. Each limited edition chalice provides 5 years of clean drinking water to women in the developing world.
So when I saw this ad, the first thing I thought was, that's a nice chalice. How much is it worth? And I went, and it's $6.25. And then I read the info on the water.org campaign, and it says that for $6.25, a person can have water for 5 years. And I'm thinking, for $6.25, I can help someone have water for 5 years. So it's that small, the amount that someone like me can help provide to help someone for 5 years. So that really brings the issue of inequality. And I thought about this company, this multinational, spending $125,000 because they're committing to 20,000 chalices. But it's according, if the campaign, if everything pans out, it's 20,000 people with water for 5 years with less than we spend on basic things. So I thought that was a very strong way, a very elegant way. You had a very beautiful woman. You had poverty treated with respect. So there are many ways that you can tell a story, that you can send a message, and that's hard. I mean, these are people who are professionals in this, but you have a wealth of information. You do very valuable research that has to go out there. People have to know it, because people know inequality exists. It's in DC, it's in Buenos Aires, it's everywhere. But you are the ones focusing on why it happens, how it can change. And I know that it's a challenge, as Eduardo was saying, to sometimes write the stories, but there is a will. And if the info is out there, and if there's a way to make it more digestible, or to have it, to be able to present it another way, we've been able to work with the president on several occasions and speak not only about politics, and so we can do it. So I think there are ways, and there are outlets, and there is a way of making sure that all the good work that you do goes and reaches people, and people know that there is info, and there is a way of explaining why they live the way they live, and there is a way to make it different in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Juan Carlos. Our next speaker is Miguel Paz, and he is a journalist from Chile. He is the president of the Podero Media Foundation, which is an organization that promotes the use of new technologies to rethink journalism and foster transparency as well as digital innovation in Latin American news organizations. He's a former Knight International Journalism Fellow, and he's currently a Neiman Berkman Fellow at Harvard University. Miguel, it's a pleasure to have you here.
Okay, so I'm gonna come from the other side, trying to be practical. First and foremost, thank you, Ricardo, Mr. President, for inviting me, for Richard. While I live here in Cambridge, I've never had the pleasure to be in Providence, so I'm really glad to be here. So you already know who I am, so I'm gonna talk about something that resounded with me all through these 2 days, which is something that happens in journalism as well. In a moment of crisis, in a moment of changing paradigms for storytelling, for the way we make our living, and we compete with many other actors in the digital sphere and the public discourse and debate, we're trying to understand, and we're starting to see that the answer to our future existence lays in the eyes of people who are not journalists, or in a more of a wikinomic structure where people that are not the experts find solutions that are not necessarily the traditional ones, but can give us answers. And there's a good example, NASA. NASA has a bunch of really amazing helium physicists that were struggling with a huge problem. And NASA did a challenge, and a retired, a former worker of an airline who's retired and lives along with his cat found the answer that these helium physicists were not finding. Of course, that generates an entire crisis, sometimes for the helium physicist or for the economist or for the journalist, which is where am I? I'm supposed to do this, and this person that has never put all the work and the time on studying came up with this idea. But I think that that's fascinating because we can embrace complexity with a perspective of faster change. And related to that, this city has one of the best design and user research and user and design anthropology research in the U.S. So having anthropologists, or what some people call high-tech anthropologists, which is designers that are going to talk with people and work with technology, having them to work with economists, for example, would be amazing. So enough of that. I'm going to tell you how this thing really works. Before doing this, or running this foundation, I was the deputy director of a news organization called El Mostrador, which is kind of like a politico.com from Chile. And we were proud to call ourselves the most efficient news organization of Chile just because we were 7 journalists. We didn't have money enough to do it. And we were changing the paradigm, while the owners of the news organization were saying, no, you shouldn't say that we're 7 people. We were like, actually, we have to say it because that makes us look way better than the entire political crew of La Tercera or El Mercurio, who are doing very lame work, you know? So here's the reality. I don't care about what you need. I don't care about how much time you put in your project, in your startup, in your report. I care about what I need, which is to satisfy the needs of my users, my audience. Second of all, we hate press releases. We hate them, especially if you send them in a JPG or if you send them in an attached document and you send a subject that has nothing to do with your press release. That's going to go on delete right away. We don't have enough time, and we're always on deadline. Usually, scientists, researchers, public policy experts say with a lot of truth in their words that when they speak with journalists, their stories get dumbed down, or that the journalist doesn't get what they're doing. Well, actually, that's pretty true because, for example, science journalists are being cut off, are being laid off, and they're working as freelance. So you're probably going to get a police beat reporter that is going to talk with you about the importance of inequality in relation to macroeconomics. So you try to avoid those areas of error, or try to put yourself in the side of the other person. Because media works for its audience, not for you. This is something that politicians, for example, really have to cope with. And also, people who are trying to, of course, express something that is really important. And I'm like, yeah, but just tell me, what does it mean? And it was like, and tell it to me in like 2 minutes. And if you don't like that, don't go to TV, because TV works that way. So if you're not willing to speak in sound bites in 1.5 minutes, it used to be 3 minutes, now it's like 30 seconds, which is more terrible, then don't do it, or find somebody that can. For media, information is a commodity, and it can weight 0 or it can weight 100. So same content that you give to everybody, you send a press release, less value. You're not going to get highlighted. Or I'm going to use you as part of my menu that I'm going to show you a little bit later. Content with some value, so that content that some have, has good value. I can go to my editor to say something. Exclusive content, awesome value. I have an exclusive with President Lagos to talk about innovation. I can sell it like that, you know? And I can give it the right space, and of course, I'm going to tell President Lagos that we're going to have to talk about the new subsidies of Transantiago, you know, whether he likes it or whether he don't, but that's the trade-off that we're going to have, you know. And related to inequality, here's a thing that I learned from a colleague that is an environmental journalist. She told me, because she was having hard times on selling stories on environment, that she had realized that environment wasn't a beat anymore. Environment is part of every single part of the production of a product, of a society, of a cultural perspective, the way we behave, the future of our children. Thinking about, for example, the reports of World Bank, which are sort of conservative, but say that the temperature in the next 60 years is going to rise heavy, and we don't have an answer yet for that. So inequality, in the same way, is not an issue that you should be selling like, hey, have this inequality report or study or work. Actually, inequality is in Hershey's. 70% of the cacao comes from Africa, and a bunch of that is farmed by kids. That's why Hershey's pays a company to trace where are those cacao coming from and try to make sure that there's no kids, because there's going to be a nightmare PR if that isn't that way. So it needs to fulfill different things. And you can decide. Actually, you can take your story and say, I'm going to slice it, I'm going to turn it into different things. It needs to serve my interest on traffic. For example, a picture of the favelas in Rio with the pools, that's probably going to engage. It's going to give me traffic. It's going to be like inequality kittens, you know? The fact that in Chile we live in split ghettos, so we don't have those pictures, so inequality is even worse because we don't see each other, not necessarily is going to drive traffic, but might generate some sort of impact on influence. So with this guy who was a master on setting up his tone message, I'm going to try to help you set up your communication strategy. So align it with your marketing, and I'm talking really commercial here because I want you to think kind of like startup-y, you know? Like, what are your marketing plan and goals, you know? And how are you going to align your communication with those goals? For example, President Lagos was a master. Whenever he wanted to express something that he wanted to like put the finger in the water or generate a clear, crystal message that he didn't want any journalists messing with, he would go to a local community radio in down south Chile or north of Chile and say, well, and by the way, I have something that I want to tell you. And he would run the narrative from there to all the newsrooms in the country. Really good on that. So, and this is important. Okay, if you have 100 points that you want to make, probably all of you are familiar with the Pareto law here, right? 20% of something generates 80% of the value. Well, which is your 20%? What is your takeaway of your message? Like what's your elevator pitch, you know? If you were to tell me all these amazing things, which is the thing that you're gonna tell me that can relate to what we do? So when you give me numbers with no meat or no, how many stories have there been written about the border crossing from Mexico to the US? And why do we keep speaking about them? It's because it's a social issue that doesn't go away, and we find new ways to tell it because it has flesh, it has life, it has hope, it has people, it's not just numbers. So what are you trying to communicate, and what are the short-term and long-term? So here's the thing. What is your style of messaging? Are you Tesla or are you Toyota? Are you Huawei or are you Apple? Are you classical music or punk music or hip hop? It really sets the tone up. This is really cool. It was created by the Knight Foundation, and then it became an independent thing. We use it a lot. Message House. You define your message and you put it in your wall, and everybody has their little house. So we are all aligned in what we want to say. Okay. Choose when and where you want to be featured. I'm going to go a little faster here. This is our information diet. This is how I run a website. Actually, the pictures in a website, for example, are placed in a way because that's dessert. And there's rice and there's steak, and everything has a value as a commodity of information. And think about times. Weekends are the best. There's always interns. You know, nobody wants to work on weekends. So if you're in an overflow of information, that's the place to go. And know your targeted journalists. That's almost the last one. And here, let me have a citizen moment or an angry citizen moment, please. We do not trust economists. Why? Huh? Why? Because economists and governments talk about average, and I live in median, you know? And the thing in Chile, at least, is that people from different ranges of the economic spectrum live in fear. Fear of getting sick, fear of getting old, fear of not taking their kids to the school, then fear of actually taking them to the university, and actually not having what to do after. So here's an example of a story. The day that Pope Francisco was announced in Chile, the most visited, most commented news story in La Tercera was a study by a Chilean professor from Diego Portales that said that you need to save almost $200,000 to get a monthly pension of $170 in Chile. You know? So last but not least, and this is an endorsement to another Chilean that I collaborate with, Cesar Hidalgo. He's launching he's announcing a new book where he talks about complexity and information. And I think that there are a bunch of social cultural aspects, things like where are our zone and types of economic structure that define a lot of the inequality and the ability to try to go beyond being an exporter of copper, for example. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Miguel. And our last panelist is Alexandra Ulmer. She is a correspondent for Reuters based in Venezuela, where she covers politics, economics, and oil. She's also reported from Argentina, Chile, the United States, and her native Switzerland. Alexandra.
Thank you. Just 1 second. Great. Thank you so much for inviting me back, Professor Schneider. It's a real treat to be here and to be sharing with these great panelists and to listen to you all the last few days. I've been reporting on Latin America for about 5 years now, and inequality has been the backdrop to a lot of the different stories I've covered. One of the first stories I reported on in Argentina was the legalization of gay marriage and the first weddings in Buenos Aires. When I arrived to Chile, the student protests were just kicking off, and at the heart of that was a quest for equality in education and beyond. And those are very compelling, interesting narratives, you know, that are unresolved and have their complexity, but they were somewhat more understandable to a general public because they mirrored a lot of the trends that were going on in the rest of the world too, or within Latin America. Since I moved to Venezuela just under a year ago, you know, the first and the greatest story right now is the severe economic crisis. I think everybody in this room is aware that the good times are a very distant memory for Venezuelans at the moment. And we're talking about, you know, dizzying numbers, a predicted contraction of 7% in the economy this year, inflation that's forecast to reach over 100%. So we're talking about hyperinflation and a bunch of other numbers, some of which we don't have access to because the central bank has been delaying publishing numbers. We don't have any GDP figures for this year. We don't have any inflation figures for this year. So it's a very multifaceted, difficult crisis with a lot of complex issues like currency controls and subsidies that have a massive impact on people's lives, but are hard to convey outside the country because, you know, they're very surreal. So this is something I and all my colleagues in Caracas and the rest of the country struggle with. Because on one hand, this lack of data has led some journalists to sensationalize what is happening or take more liberties than the ethics of our profession would suggest. So I was hoping to just talk a bit about how we try to explain what is happening in an economic crisis that's obviously going to have massive impact on a country's poor and presumably on inequality. Though I'm not going to venture any theories on that. I'll leave that to you all. So I'm going to use photographs done by two excellent Reuters photographers in Caracas, Jorge Silva and Carlos Rawlings, because Venezuela is a hugely visual story, and it's one thing for me to tell you that I saw hundreds of women lining up in the hot Caribbean sun hoping diapers would arrive. It's another thing for you to see that picture. Again, though, it's much better to be accompanied with data to avoid that kind of sensationalist impact. So Venezuela in many senses, the quintessential Latin American development paradox, right? It's filthy rich in oil, but also cocoa, coffee, steel, all sorts of minerals, etc. Yet it is deeply unequal and is struggling at the moment. So here you have a picture of 360, a fashionable bar and top of a fancy hotel, in Caracas, overlooking the beautiful Avila, and beneath you have a poblacion near Charayave. So these differences clash all the time in Venezuela, just as they do in Brazil and Argentina and much of the rest of the world. So yeah, just a few more images. A few years ago I might have talked about the impact of the Great Venezuelan Housing Mission and its shortcomings, but I think today the appropriate thing is to talk about the economic crisis. Right. So the backbone of the crisis, in many ways, are currency controls. They were implemented in 2003, and they're an absolutely headache-inducing mechanism. It has 3 tiers of official currencies at the moment, plus a black market rate. Even for economists, it's difficult to understand, especially given the scant information. So, just brought this as an example. This is the biggest denomination in Venezuela at the moment. It's 100 bolivares. So, to give you an idea, if I use the 6.3 rate, which is the strongest official rate in Venezuela at the moment, which is mostly used for food and medicine, this is $16. Yeah? But if I use the black market rate, which yesterday was about $2.75, and it's probably weakened since, so take this as a pinch of salt, this is 35 cents, right? This is the biggest bill. So that impacts everything. The most visible impact in the streets of the country, these currency controls, are the huge lines we're seeing. I live next to a supermarket, and the past 2 months, every morning when I've walked out to go to work, there have been queues of hundreds of people for, what can't we find right now? Diapers, milk, detergent, soap, razors, meat. Meat is running scarce recently. I haven't seen the lines ultimately because they've started putting them in the parking lots underneath supermarkets, apparently to protect people from sun. Though some people say it's to reduce the visual impact of what's happening. I was in the western state of Zulia last week, and the shortages are very acute there because it's outside Caracas, so it's a little less taken care of, and it's close to the Colombian border, and there's a huge amount of smuggling and contraband of everything from diapers to gasoline across the border to Colombia. And there were queues of women waiting, and they didn't know what they were waiting for because they weren't sure what the truck would bring that day. And many of them had babies because there's no one to take care of them at home, or they had asked for the day off from work and they didn't have help that day, or they didn't work, or it was their day off and they were spending it queuing up. And one of the most impacting sound bites, as Miguel was talking about sound bites, was a 20-year-old woman who had a shirtless baby in her arms saying, "I can't have any more kids right now because I can't even take care of this one." And that's a very concrete impact of huge economic distortion, and it's something that we as journalists can try to convey. So, for instance, but as pictures also don't tell the whole story. I was there that day. It was right after Christmas when the shortages got really bad because they were going to slow down over Christmas. A lot of the shops had taken all their inventories out before Christmas, and suddenly, a few days after New Year's, there was nothing left in the shops. There was a bit of panic buying, and people just went to the streets of Caracas. This is a Bicentenario, so a state-run supermarket in central Caracas. What strikes me about this picture is that it wasn't taken at the worst moment. When I was there, the queue was much bigger, and there was a queue to get into that precinct that was stretched outside into the street. So we're talking 2,000, 3,000 people. This is toilet paper, which is another one that is running scarce, big time. Right, and we always talk about toilet paper or detergent because it's something we use every day, but there's also shortages of medicine. There's shortages of spare parts, there's shortages of machinery, basically anything you have to import, very hard to get nowadays. So this is a fumigation in Petare, I believe, one of the slums, because there was a chikungunya outbreak. It's a mosquito-borne disease last year, and there are no fever relievers. There weren't any fever relievers. Something very simple like that cannot be controlled if you don't have medicine, and that's obviously going to have a major, severe impact on the population. Right, this medicine is a farmatodo, so a pharmacy, people waiting for medicines. I'm here in the United States, and I'm bringing Pampers back for my colleague because she stored some, but she's nervous. So she's asked me to bring some back for her two-year-old child. Some more photos of the currencies you can see. Can you imagine walking around with 2 bolívares. I mean, you really can't do anything. Which brings me to my next point, which is inflation, right? It's the infamous poor person's tax, and it's long been a big problem in Latin America, and it hadn't, but it's reared its head quite viciously in Venezuela at the moment. So as I said, a lot of economists are predicting that Venezuela is going to dip into hyperinflation this year. It comes in no secret, inflation really dents your purchasing power, especially when it reaches those levels. So one of the most common conversations one here in Caracas is, have you seen the price of meat? I went to the supermarket and guess how much this costs? And people are just shocked because it's going so quickly and it's picking up steam. So the minimum wage in Venezuela is around above 5,000 bolívares, so about $20-something on the black market. This also is impacting a lot of the mid-level educated professors, and that's what's very compelling to me and a lot of the outside audience, because you think, wow, that could be me. I mean, a few weeks ago I was at a party, and this young 20-year-old architect who has an undergraduate degree, who has a graduate degree, works for the state in designing a Caracas park, was saying, the other day I was reading an article on how about a quarter of the world's population survives on less than $2 a day. And I was thinking, God, how terrible the world is. And then I started to think, I took out a calculator and I calculated my own salary, and I earn less than $2 a day. And that's the kind of anecdote that obviously is very middle class and isn't the same thing as the reality as the woman who's queuing up for hours in a slum, but that people outside can understand and think, wow, this kind of economic distortions are hitting people like me. If I were in that country, this is what I would be experiencing right now. I mean, ditto, an oil engineer I spoke to in Maracaibo as well last week, who was telling me, I have 2 decades in the industry and I'm earning $60 a day. I'd be better off selling empanadas. That was his quote. And it's true, we're seeing a migration of people towards the service industries or towards industries where they have contact with people who earn hard currency, or people who have, are wealthy. So taxi services, hotels, whatever, tourism is still going on. Right, and then there's the kind of non-economic aspects that are also affecting inequality. Violence, the obvious one, these are gunshot victims in a Petare hospital. Violence, as you know, is unbelievably high in Venezuela and affects all strands of society, but of course, the poor are always the most exposed. There's a tension there because a lot of at least the foreign correspondents live in the wealthier areas, which I said are not immune, but don't see the nightly shootouts that often do happen in the slums. And I'm guilty of that too, because I know that happens. But when I read, 2-3 weeks ago that there had a Colombian had been killed in the mall I go to, it's right around the corner in broad daylight, that affected me, and that started making me think that I was, the situation was worsening. Whereas actually, is it necessarily? Is it because it's coming closer to me that I'm reacting a certain way? It's obviously when you're a foreign reporter living in these conditions, you're in a sort of bubble, even if you go out for your daily reporting. Yes, some more pictures of violence as a funeral for a gang member. It's a big cultural rite of going around motorcycles and often weapons to say goodbye to this. And yes, thank you. And these are pictures of Venezuelans leaving, as many middle class and some higher class Venezuelans are doing, because all the things I mentioned. You can't find diapers, your salary is worthless, and you're scared, essentially. But of course, the power to leave or the ability to leave isn't properly distributed either. It's been from what statistics indicate, and often it's academic research actually, it's been mostly a middle class phenomenon. And I've also spoken to poor people who said, well, we're not happy with the situation, but where do we go? And things wouldn't be easy for us somewhere else either, and we have no capital to start off with, and no significant network. So that all leads me to assume from what I've seen in my reporting that a lot of this crisis is of course affecting the poorer strata in a much more powerful way. There are some things I can't find in Venezuela, no matter how much I look, more or less. But there are others that I can. I've bought olive oil at a specialty store for the equivalent, about a third of a Venezuelan monthly salary, $8 or something. It doesn't feel good, but I have the ability to do it, and I'm not hurting anybody by doing it necessarily. But it's a clear evidence that I am able to overcome this economic crisis in a way the poor people cannot. So it's difficult to properly understand how this economic crisis is affecting poverty and inequality. because this unraveling is happening so quickly, because there's incomplete or insufficient data, and it's difficult to communicate all that, especially because Venezuela is very much its own reality at the moment. But this crisis is, and the same time, this crisis is so severe and is having such an obvious impact on the population that we do have these incredible stories that we can tell. What we're always in need of is data, and I know it's very hard. You face a lot of the same problems in trying to understand what's going on, and especially trying to do a thorough but quick analysis, which is often what we need when there's a major crisis that is shifting so quickly. But that's definitely, from my point of view, where academia would be hugely helpful. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alexandra. I want to open the floor up now for questions. I think what we'll do is take a round of, say, 5 or so, and then give our panelists a chance to respond. Nora Lustig, I saw your hand up.
Yeah, I mean, this has been a fascinating experience, and I have, let me say a few comments. First, Miguel, I was surprised that you complain, well, I mean, you can complain about economists, but that you said that because they talk about averages, when the last day and a half was exactly the opposite. So I wonder, were we unable to convince you that economists also talk about the distribution of things and not just averages? Because that's all we did. Practically we didn't mention averages. To all, I wanted to ask, you were flying in the wall. I don't know if you realized, which is probably not what you're used to. I mean, well, you're sort of like an outlier in this way, because you're a professor. But in general, when people talk to an audience that is not a non-specialist audience, they do it differently, of course, because we all have our Ning language, which is not necessarily shared by everybody. You go to a scientist conference, they're going to use their own language. You go to economists, political scientists, we all have our language. So we were not doing any attempt to make ourselves clear to the broader public. So I wonder, what did you come out with from all the things what is it that struck you the most? And I know that it struck, you were struck by the commitment to equity. So we have to recognize Peter Hakem is the one who coined that term. So he has a flair for media impact, I suppose. But what did you come away with from a conference that was not trying to tell you, the group of people who are in the media, things in a way that would be translatable? Was it useful, or is it, do we need to really change our discourse in order to be able to communicate? Do we have to have 2 different types of presentations? Or was it useful to hear us as, raw, without any...
Dana Grasbord, Brown University.
Hi, thank you. This was really great. It was really refreshing to be reminded of the importance of storytelling. I think many of us encourage our students, if they want to be policy relevant, to take their statistics classes and maybe become economists. So I will now encourage them to do that, and also to take writing classes and photography classes and design classes. So that was really nice. I have 2 quick questions. One is about, so Nora reminded us yesterday about even within this group we can't agree on the metrics and the numbers. And so how do you make responsible decisions about picking up data and circulating the data? Because the data that you all circulate actually becomes politically valent in a way. And so I was wondering about that. And the second question is about a point John Lee Anderson made, which is we can take things like the bestia, or children coming across the borders, and use them to sort of, they're sensational sort of crisis moments that gain some kind of attention, but poverty and crisis are kind of sexy, and inequality is politically complicated and requires sustained attention. So how do we deal with that in the media? Thank you.
Other questions or comments at this point? Vito Tanzi?
Yeah, the Alexandra story, I'm not sure whether the story is inequity, the fight against inequity, or the message that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. You know, I'm not sure what is the message we get from what is going on in Venezuela.
The future of socialism in Latin America.
Other questions or comments before we turn back to the panelists?
That you described.
Yes.
So at the beginning, there was a lot of talk about the inclusion of narratives into this sort of academic talk, and my question is, to what extent or how do we include into these narratives that are supposed to create solutions and influence policy, or perhaps simply increase our understanding of inequality? Where do we fit the experiences of these people? Because we've talked, or we've sort of briefly talked about how does it feel to be unequal, or to live in an unequal society, but how do we fit the experiences of these people? Is it only anthropologists who are supposed to do that? Is it simply journalists who are supposed to come and talk to these people? How do the political scientists incorporate a narrative into a paper, into their work?
Thank you. And one more question. Yes.
So it's a comment really on something that Nora said about being a fly in the wall. So I think we can do different things with our work, right? And some of it is the kitchen, and some of it is the presentation of the dish. And I think what happened is that you guys came into the kitchen, right? So this is part of the kitchen, which is when we're sitting there with our little axioms and theorems, and now we're probably crap at presenting our dishes, really, but you haven't seen us trying.
That's what I was
Yeah, this is what Nora was trying to say. If you did see us trying, you'd probably laugh anyway. But just to be clear that, so for example, in some of my area of work on inequality of opportunity, I have papers with lots of mathematics and proofs and theorems, which is what I would do here. But then I also have stories with, two kids being born on the same day. One, to a single mother in Rwanda, and one to an educated family in Sweden, what their lives will look like, which convey inequality of opportunity to people in a better way. So just to say that although we are generally crap, and I actually, unlike Nora, I completely agree that people don't trust economists. I don't know if it's because we talk about averages. I think it's because we sort of are actually fairly terrible at communicating things, and people think, look, the economy is such a mess. You're an economist, so therefore,
it's your fault. It's your fault.
But just a comment to say that we weren't trying to present and communicate to you at this conference. That is what we were.
So
Thank you.
that makes
We'll
it
take
more
one more from Victoria
I'm
Murillo,
not
Columbia
an economist,
University.
so I don't mean to be
It's a
defensive.
controlled experience.
But I have a question for the panel. So something that really calls my attention is that the issue of inequality was more or less taken for granted in Eduardo's presentation, in John Lee's presentation. So I think this is something that Maria Esperanza said, but those coming from Latin America, either Maria Esperanza said this is not even an issue. Alexandra presented the consequences of an effort of redistribution to reduce inequality that doesn't seem to have worked very well. And so, to what extent, from the point of view of the press, I mean, this is the point that Maria Esperanza said is true. I mean, is this an issue, or is this an issue in the US because of the top 1%, and this was in the media, and that's why, people are paying attention to it?
Okay, let's give our panelists a shot. And maybe we'll go in reverse order from the presentations, and we'll start with Alexandra.
Sure. Vito, you asked about what the takeaway message is for Venezuela. I think there are plenty, and it probably depends on where you are in the political spectrum. I think history is still being written, where Venezuela's in a slow unraveling, and we don't know what's going to happen. Many people are linking it to the age-old oil curse, and Venezuela becoming a victim of that yet again. Others are using it as a message of warning of what can happen in under a charismatic populist leader with little fiscal responsibility. And I'd be very weary of trying to force a message, especially as a member of the press. It doesn't. It's a good question though.
Okay, thank you. Miguel?
Yeah. I'm going to answer you with a joke. I'm talking about other economists. No, but what I was telling you, it wasn't around, and I'm sorry if it didn't get through, it wasn't about I don't trust you in a sense, you know. It's coming from a country from Chile. I would also like to say that it's not economists, it's like commercial engineers and lawyers, you know. Because bottom line, the problem for people is that there has been a promise that came with it, with the restitution of democracy, of if you cope with this New Deal, where education is a service, health is a service, and everything is a service that anybody can go in and create an enterprise and decide whatever they want to do with that enterprise. And you pay your taxes and you effort and you be an entrepreneur, like an entrepreneur for your life with your family. You're gonna get the pay, kind of like the Latino American dream, American dream. But the fact is that, and I don't want, I'm going to use a personal experience. I know that is statistically not relevant to that, but I'm a person that has access to information. I'm a person that actually has access to talk with the lawyers that make lawsuits against the healthcare insurance companies in Chile. So after suffering the fact that I was in the public healthcare system because I wanted to support it with my bigger salary than other people in Chile, and face the fact that I had two options, which was your first child was gonna be born in a room with 25 other women and you won't be able to see it before 2 days, or in the same public hospital, you have a 5-star hotel room that costs more than in the clinic. I said, well, for the next child, we're gonna give it a try with a private thing. But since I know that they're very fishy, I'm gonna do research. So I'm gonna go and speak with different lawyers and people who are in this area. So I got a plan that was called Motherhood Cost Zero, you know? And it's ironic that while having the first woman President Bachelet in her first term and not in this term, has talked about the inequality of the amount of money that women in childbirth age pay in comparison to men, which talks about the intertwine between politics and money as well. So, and with getting all that information, I still had to pay $3,000 for my Motherhood Cost Zero child, because I hadn't read the fine print that said that actually the cost was being updated each 6 months. So, and I had waited 3 years to have a second baby, you know. So the problem on that is that people are in Chile, and I would say in other areas, are very much in distrust with all of this. And in the images or the messages that are being sent by, I still remember Andres Velasco, genius from Harvard. He had tenure. Come on. But his relation to us or as citizens was zero. So, so when we talk about it, it's the same way that Sports Illustrated Sports Illustrated once did a story on which was the most well-paid basketball team, and that was the Cavaliers with LeBron James, and the first time that LeBron James was in the Cavaliers. But the problem is that LeBron James made like $10 million, and the rest of his players made $100,000. So the average of that was, yeah, they were the best paid, but the reality wasn't. So just check Forbes. If you see the ranking Forbes, and you just count the amount of billionaires. Chile has more billionaires than Venezuela, Argentina, and and Colombia combined. And we only export copper, finance, and vulture retail. We don't generate value at all of that. So of course people are in fear. And you ask anybody in Chile if they consider themselves rich, and no, everybody's gonna tell you that they're middle class, no matter if they make 10 million or, yeah. So, and just to finish about what I learned about the difference of data between World Bank and others, and I would suggest we make a hackathon and take a week instead of taking a mega committee to research on that. And the other is that I felt that there was a lot of effort and focus on labor and education, but not about social entrepreneurship, for example, or ways of making, for example, to donate money in Chile, you need to be very rich. And usually that donation is ideological. It's $20 million that get donated to Los Andes University from Opus Dei, you know? But if I have a business friend that would like to donate money for our foundation, and he's a company that generates $5 million, he would like to donate, but it's so complicated for him to generate, you know, to contribute to those other areas.
Thank you. Juan Carlos Lopez.
On the issue, is it an issue? Yes. And I think it's an issue because people live it, and they see it, and they feel it. Sometimes if you live inequality, you're not thinking about it because you're worried about getting through the day, and you're getting through the month that you were mentioning, paying school. So it's always an issue, but there's so many issues that it has to be presented in the right context. Now, on listening to the raw information, I wasn't here for the sessions, but I know that as journalists, we talk about many issues, and our death is this big. So we rely on experts like you do. And I was talking about Anna's report. I'm going to read the report because I believe that my responsibility is that if people watch what I do, read what I produce, they trust that I've done my job. So even though the title might not be something I'm used to, I want to look at the information. And there's been many cases where we get official information, and when you look at the official information, there is no validity to it. And I have specific cases. There was a report that came out of the White House that said that Cuba had become the main destination for pedophiles. And I was surprised because I knew that was a very tough issue in Cuba, and I know that there was a crackdown in Thailand, I believe it was, but that had been just less than a year before that. And they quoted a specific report from a specific university. So I went to the university, I read the report, and the report said the contrary. It said that it wasn't a destination. And so I reported that. But not everyone has the time to go ahead and do that. So you look at the sources. That's where you choose your numbers from. That's where you choose. And you look at the numbers. I like to look at the numbers, and I like to compare and see if they match up, if they're true, if the organization is reliable or not, if our internal standards allow us to report on that. And it's just a hit and miss. But it's our responsibility to do our part of the job and to reflect what you are doing. So it's an important process, and it's very difficult to compete with a lot of things that are out there, with the cats and with the cute cats and the fast pace of life and with social media. But there's still space to tell the stories, and there's still space to talk about inequality.
Thank you. Esperanza Casillo?
Okay, first, I think that a lot of the things, I think there's a big part. First of all, I think it's fascinating that this panel was assembled, because in most academic conferences, we never get these kind of discussions. There's also a big part of the puzzle that's absent here, which are politicians and policymakers. I mean, a lot of these questions should not be addressed to academics, because our responsibility is produce the data, and if we do that, then that's plenty, you know. I mean, a lot of the dissatisfactions that a lot of people, or a lot of the responsibility of creating these narratives, that does not necessarily lie with researchers and college professors, if we're talking about policy making. Or some of us might have a much more pronounced policy or political interest and are willing to go into the public sphere and try to create our own narratives. I'm working with a project that CELS, the human rights organization in Argentina, is bringing about trying to do something with habitat issues and inequality in habitat development and housing and city building. But that's not necessarily the case with everybody that does research, and that's fine, right? I mean, it's not that we all have to be policy activists. But and also I think Eduardo pointed to the necessity of doing this kind of conference in Latin America, and it's funny because all during yesterday I was emailing friends in Argentina saying, look guys, we need to get funding to do this exact conference in Argentina because these are debates that are fascinating and there's a lot of data, and this data basically isn't necessarily circulating back home. So that's another issue, right? We need to, besides the narrative building and all that, there's a wealth of data that somehow, or at least for people who are not working in this debate, doesn't necessarily circulate in the places where Latin American policies are made. And last, I expect, Richard, that in 6 months or a year, you're going to have our journalism conferences where academics get to do the same kind of criticism to journalists and media professionals, and pointing to the many, many failings that media have, at least back home, in dealing with issues of inequality and redistribution and taxes and policies. Because we might be crappy in bringing about our arguments, but I am sure that many, many times the media just brings about just disinformation and pure analysis and sloppy use of the data.
Thank you. John Lee Anderson?
Well, I was, what Miguel was saying about distrusting economists rang a bell, not with this group, of course. But in fact, throughout the last few days, I was thinking about that. I think in the same way that there's a sense that many economists' information is mitigated, that is to say, it's laundered through the filter of their sponsors, whether commercial or academic or governmental. A lot of times the results of their research are intended for a certain filter, just as geologists often work for oil companies or mining interests. So I think that's part of the problem. But I think it's also, more generally speaking, there's a kind of skepticism with economic information amongst the layman journalists, because it's very often used. In fact, it's regularly used by politicians to beat a certain drum. And I kept thinking back to not Latin America, Iraq, in post-invasion in 2003, when Paul Bremer, who was appointed as the viceroy of the occupation for that first year, it became more and more tetchy as things got, more and more irritable with journalists as things got worse, and repeatedly cited economic data and also empirical evidence that things were fine, when some of us who were coming and going from the green zone to the red zone were hearing that things were turning bad, that there was an insurgency boiling. And I remember distinctly having a conversation with him in August 2003, in which he lambasted me. It was a private encounter, and suggested that I didn't know what I was talking about when I tried to ask him whether he was starting to get worried about the symptoms, of an unrest in the country. And he quoted to me, as he'd done in various public, how there was traffic jams now in Iraq, and people had cell phones. He was using, the kind of consumer evidence of an economic boom to ascribe almost, emerging democratic values to this benighted society, which he and most of us didn't really know lay under the surface. And I remember coming away, unable to really argue with him about what he was seeing, and because all I had was a feeling. But it was a couple of weeks before the very first big suicide bomb. It was a couple of weeks before the UN envoy was killed, and everything began to go south from there. So that's part of it. That's part of it. And, you know, wherever you live, you tend to get that. But to the question you sort of broadly asked me, and it was sort of asked by you too, Miguel, about, you know, how does a political scientist, it's all about framing, basically. That's all I think it is. You know, Claude Lévi-Strauss was able to write a great book on anthropology because he had a narrative sense, you know, and there's, you know, for instance, and there's other examples, which was somehow lasting. It may not have been entirely accurate in the end, but that's sort of not really the issue. And you asked me how, Nora, how to write about the things that weren't sexy like The Beast. Well, who said The Beast was sexy? You know, are the children on the border sexy or sensational? They're sensational because we ascribe a certain emotional impact to the arrival of children on the border. But in fact, these stories are there all the time. Every time I've ever had to cover Latin America, I've had to deal with or to confront and to address an issue of inequality. It's not been the purpose and of poverty, and usually of lack of rule of law and crime, which are directly linked. A couple of the speakers today especially spoke to that, and to me, it's the issue. If I had to say that there's one major change in the life that I've spent reporting on Latin America from the 1980s until now, it's that 30 years ago, there was an armed insurgent outlet to poverty in Latin America, and it was a definite feature. It was the feature of my reporting life as a young reporter. That's entirely gone, with the exception of Colombia, which is somehow a non-story. Good question, how to make that one sexy, right? When it become white noise because it's been going on for 60 years. But what has replaced it? An endemic criminal insurgency, which you know, is not political, therefore has no name, but which has effectively co-opted the poor in many parts of Latin America. The emergence of a black economy, narcotráfico, which simply wasn't there back in the 1960s and is there today, and the highest rates of violence in the world outside of the Middle East for political violence. That's a story, and that is a story that I felt, you know, the door was open to it a couple of times in this conference, and it could have been opened wider. I think that I mean, there are a lot of stories, call them sexy, call them whatever you want, that lie in that intersection between the issues we've been talking about of poverty and social inequality and the lack of rule of law, organized crime, and in a sense, the abdication of the state's responsibilities, both in territories and by certain states, of rule of law to its criminal underclass. Those are some of the, that's how I decided to frame certain stories. You know, I went to Venezuela and I hung out with a criminal who was the boss of a building which was a vertical slum. I hung out with capos traficantes in Rio de Janeiro who effectively were allowed to police their slums with the connivance of a corrupt law enforcement system and judiciary, which again, almost, not just by omission, almost by design now, has effectively partnered with this criminal underclass, with the underworld in the policing of the poor. In El Salvador, por Dios, you know, the presidential palace, when I was there a couple of years ago, literally negotiated with the leaders of the Maras for a tregua, for a ceasefire, which recently broke down, bringing down the homicide rate in the country. But it was actual negotiation, as if, you know, the mayor of Gotham was negotiating with Penguin in the sewer. That's the situation we have in a lot of Latin America, and that, for me, is the big story of inequality. And I don't think it needs particularly sexing up in order to be framed in ways that make sense or interest the broader public. And whether you're a political scientist, sociologist, economist, or journalist, I think it's there, you know.
Thanks very much, John Lee. So we have what we call here in the Academy a two-finger question from Ricardo Lagos, former president of Chile. So I wanted to allow him to jump in, and then we'll turn to Eduardo for some final responses. Ricardo, did you want to say a word?
Well, what I would like to say is that I think has been quite an interesting seminar, 2 days seminar here. We started with some facts,
And then the discussion today was mainly about how you're going to interpret those figures. And to what extent those figures means that you cannot just present figures. Because let's be very realistic. All these people around this room are using figures, data, but with a purpose. And that's the difference between an economist and the others, because the economists are political economists at the very end. And either you are talking about Adam Smith, or you're talking about Keynes, or you're talking about whatever of those guys, all of them at the very end were politics. And you are using data in order to know what are the facts. But the problem with these people that used to think about societies is that at the very end they are rather dangerous. Because that people that used to think about society, after a while think that society can be a little bit different of what you have today. And therefore you think that it's possible for the human being to change that society, to improve it. And it's true what Maria Esperanza says, that probably we should have started this discussion, is equality bad or good? And let us be very realistic, there is no society where is 100% equality. And the question is, what is the gradient? What is the way toward a more egalitarian, understanding that all of us are different by definition as human beings? Thank God, even though I don't believe so much in God. But that's true. And after I say this, then I would say that in addition to that, then it's true. We are only to produce data, not only, because at the very end, we try to interpret what are we trying to do. And this morning we listened to a wonderful lecture, beginning when the human beings stand up in this planet. And then that was the discussion this morning, how equality or inequality arranged in the beginning of our human being living in society. Why I say this? Because I think that the last panel has been extremely interesting in a sense that here there was somebody that told us a lot of tools that you can use to improve equality. And that was was Eduardo Porter that introduced to us to that question. So say, what about the intellectual property right? What about the rules on environment? What about how to face monopolies, competition, labor legislation, etc.? And then it was very interesting the way that John Lee told us, how are you going to translate the jargon of economy so that you can be understood by the rest of the world? And let me put it the other way around. How you, members of the press, are going to be able to read part of the jargon and to put it so that everybody can understand. And this is what I think was so fascinating what Juan Carlos Lopez told us about how to present the budget of the US and the way to compare with the other Latin American countries. And why I say this? Because it seems to me that when Miguel passed trying to say, look, I was referring to other economists, no, what you are referring is particularly those economists that are looking for how can I get a better improvement in the rate of return of capital of this particular pension fund. But most of the people that is looking the data about equality or disequality are much more interested in public policies. And if you're interested in public policies, at the very end, you think that it's possible to change society through public policies. And that's it. And if we are dealing with the question of a real example of what happens when you try to fight to have equality, not for the right tools, then Alexander Hulmer presented to us that trying to get equality, look what happened, the most unequal country, etc. But after saying this, what I would like to conclude is at the very end, I do believe that in a democracy, there are many ways to define that. But I like a definition that says that in a democracy, we human beings, we citizens, we like to define what is the minimum that society needs to function. And needless to say that that minimum that society needs to function, understanding that human beings have dignity, is defined by every generation according to the resources of that society. And the society that has a $5,000 per capita income has some definition quite different from that has 25. Where we are now in Latin America, learning to live in a much bigger society. And the demands are different demands of demand that we used to have 25 or 30 years ago, precisely for the reason that you mentioned. And therefore, it is the question today, how are we going to be able to keep our societies that make a room for human beings where goods are going to be available in order to be able to develop our own ideas and our own system. In short, I think that this seminar has been extremely useful. First, to know a little bit more about data, but probably to see that if we wanted to interpret that data, we need a lot of more public policy and a lot of more seminars like this one. And I think that the next time then probably we're going to start bringing some journalists so that probably then Maria Esperanza will do the right question. Why do you think that it's good to have more equality, or why in some societies it's better a little bit of inequality in order to produce also the development of human beings? And thank you all of you for coming here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We literally have 2 more minutes in the room. Eduardo, I don't know if you wanted to say something at the end because you didn't get a chance to reply.
I like economists.
You're populist, man.
You know, I'm not an economist. I like economists. I mean, I understand why they're feared. They wield a lot of power over policy, and they deal with a lot of stuff that is often non-intuitive and complex, and that power can be misused. I mean, in the context of Iraq and misuse of data, economists wouldn't be the first people that come to mind. You know, there's this guy at the United Nations, you know, that would come first. Yeah, no, I think economists are necessary, and kitchen conversations like the ones that you've had here are part of the process. But since you did invite us here, and we know that ultimately what you do want to do is influence policy, the recommendations have to be how can you effectively ultimately influence policy. And part of that is teaching us how to write about what you do. And that is how to build narratives out of what you do. I don't think you always need the vulture looking over the little baby, you know, and that narrative is not the only narrative available. In fact, I would say that Thomas Piketty is a great example of a narrative where there's no dead babies and, you know, and a ton of data. His book became a huge bestseller because he was able to articulate, well, this is a history of the world. And, you know, you might argue with how he presented the history of the world, but he gave us a history. This is where it started, and we had like kings and queens and things, and then capitalists, and this is, I'm going to tell you how the world works. And that's very fascinating to people, although I understand that an Amazon search of how far people had read into the book meant that everybody ended at like page 67 at the end of the introduction.
It's a long history.
Yeah, no, it's actually had an afterlife in the culture, and in fact there are papers that have you know economic. There's a paper by Larry Summers on Henry Ford raising the daily wage to $5. That paper was huge, and it's in part because it had this purchase on real stuff, and so there was theory behind it, there was data in it, and there was history. So I don't think it's that really difficult. I think this was particularly kitcheny, especially yesterday. This morning, I think there was more because it was necessarily trying to link it to the political process and political phenomenon that we had more intuitive grasp onto it. And yesterday, I felt that there was a lot of kind of like very narrow empirical windows with little theory behind them, and so it's difficult to kind of like thread a needle and say, oh man, there's a column there, you know. But you can do this. I'm gonna end up by showing off. I mean, my column yesterday was Wednesday. Yeah, my column yesterday was about income inequality, and ultimately, even though I only use the word once, I just started with dead babies and short life expectancies and high teenage pregnancy rates and high incarceration rates. And there's economic research linking these things to inequality. So just to the point that we don't know whether inequality is good or bad, in fact, at least in the context of the United States, there is a hell of a lot of research effort going into that question. And in fact, even in the IMF has done some really good work in developing countries about the impact of inequality on the sustainability of growth. So I do think that there's a recognition that we need to answer these questions, and there is a body of people that are looking at that. But so anyway, and that's a way, and that column was very successful by my standards. I mean, it was a very successful column. People did comment about it a lot. And so, of course, they're not reacting to, you know, the Gini coefficient. They're reacting to the dead babies. But it can be done. It's possible. I don't know. There were a few other questions out there. On the use of data, I think it's a really good question. I come into that problem a lot. And it's, you know, I had the mistake of using two different sources of data in the same column, which actually say sort of different things, but I didn't notice until it was published. So you use tax receipts for one measure of inequality in the chart, and then you use the CPS for your other measure of inequality in the story, and they're different because the CPS is top-coded, and you're kind of like, your readers are writing, what are you saying here is not what you're saying here. So, I mean, I use, my rule of thumb is if it's a powerful institution, I trust their data, which I'm sure is a bad rule of thumb.
Yes.
But on deadline, so, you know, OECD, Luxembourg Income Study, IMF, but then you're always subject to, okay, it was wrong, and then you go back in and you write it again. So at the end of the day, we're just the first draft, right? We're not, you know, forever.
Okay. On that note, we're not forever. We should end the conference, or we're going to be forcibly ejected from the room. There's another event here in a couple minutes.
Very quick?
Sure, very, very short.
Very
because
quick.
we're really over.
Sometimes you know where you're going, but you don't want to get there. You want to get there a different way. And when we were all speaking at the end, we were listening, I remembered Eduardo Galeano, who recently passed away. And the power of Las Venas Abiertas de America Latina, the impact it had, and what he thought about his own book at the end. And so the work that you do is very important, and sometimes we don't want to hear the truth, and we don't want to hear how things are. And I think a very important point that you brought out is the joint responsibility that we have. And we talked about what you do, we didn't talk about what we do, but we have a responsibility of knowing what we're talking about, and we have a responsibility of telling stories that maybe people don't want to hear, even if they know where they're going. So that's what I wanted to bring up, such a huge name in literature, but that experience, I think, is a good example of what we're talking about.
Great. Thank you very much for a wonderful conference.